Welcome to our channel, where we will delve into the deep mysteries behind the famous stories you've known since childhood. Today, we will explore a tale that is far from unfamiliar, Snow White. This is a story that everyone has heard at some point, but do you really know all the hidden truths behind it? The story of Snow White has long been a staple of childhood literature, but its origins and the layers of meaning behind the tale are often overlooked. To fully understand the depth of Snow White, we must first explore its origins and how it has evolved over time. The version most people are familiar with comes from the brothers Grimm, who published it in their Children's and Household Tales in 1812. However, the roots of the story reach far deeper into history, blending folklore, cultural myths, and societal values that have shaped its telling. The earliest known version of Snow White can be traced back to a German folk tale, though elements of it can be found in other cultures as well. The core of the story, a beautiful young woman whose stepmother, consumed with jealousy, attempts to kill her, is an archetype that spans many cultures and often symbolizes the battle between innocence and corruption. In fact, versions of this story can be found across Europe, in countries like France, Italy, and even in the tales of ancient Rome. In these earlier versions, Snow White's beauty is often seen as a divine gift, a symbol of purity and perfection. At the heart of Snow White lies the theme of beauty, both external and internal. The stepmother's jealousy of Snow White's beauty is a driving force of the plot, and in many versions of the story, her obsession with being the fairest of them all mirrors societal obsessions with vanity, youth, and physical appearance. It is clear that beauty plays a central role in this tale, not just as a superficial trait, but as something that becomes a source of power and danger. Snow White's beauty is the key that unlocks the conflict, as it is her very presence that causes the stepmother's jealousy, and, ultimately, her attempt to destroy Snow White. Another important theme is the concept of innocence and its clash with envy and corruption. Snow White represents innocence and purity, while the stepmother embodies the destructive force of envy. The stepmother's obsession with beauty and her desire to maintain her position as the fairest reveal a dark side of human nature, the willingness to harm others to preserve one's self-image. This struggle between innocence and corruption is timeless, and it speaks to universal fears and desires within human nature. In its earliest forms, the story of Snow White did not feature the same happy ending that we are familiar with today. In some versions, the story ends in tragedy, with Snow White not waking up from her poisoned sleep or with her suffering in other ways. This shift toward a more optimistic ending occurred over time, as the tale was adapted to meet changing societal values and to cater to the expectations of young audiences. The transformation of the story, from a cautionary tale filled with darker, more tragic elements to a tale of redemption and triumph, reflects the evolving nature of fairy tales themselves, which often shift in tone and message depending on the needs and values of the society that tells them. The Tale of Snow White also reflects the cultural concerns of its time. In the early 19th century, when the brothers Grimm published their version, Germany was undergoing significant social and political upheaval. The focus on beauty, envy, and the roles of women in society can be seen as a reflection of the gender dynamics of that time. The story presents a strong contrast between Snow White's passivity and the stepmother's active aggression, suggesting a tension between idealized femininity, embodied by Snow White, and the dangerous consequences of unchecked female power, as represented by the stepmother. Moreover, the Grimm version of Snow White is framed within a larger cultural context of fairy tales that often depict women as either virtuous and passive or villainous and aggressive. The stepmother's jealousy, for instance, is portrayed as a corrupting force that leads to her eventual downfall, whereas Snow White's purity and innocence lead to her ultimate redemption. This dichotomy between good and evil, innocence and corruption, is a theme that runs through many fairy tales and Snow White is no exception. As the story of Snow White spread beyond Germany and across the world, it was adapted into many different versions, each reflecting the culture that embraced it. Over time, the image of the fairest of them all became a widely recognized symbol in literature and culture, and the basic narrative of Snow White remained consistent, though variations in character details and plot elements emerged. Despite these differences, the central themes of beauty, envy, innocence, and corruption have remained central to the story, which continues to captivate audiences today. Thus, the origins of Snow White are not simply found in a single culture or time period. Instead, the story is a mosaic of ancient myths, cultural beliefs, and universal fears about beauty, power, and jealousy. It is a tale that transcends time and geography, offering lessons that resonate across generations. As we dive deeper into the world of Snow White, it becomes clear that much of the story's intrigue comes from its powerful symbolism. Beyond the simple narrative of a young girl and her jealous stepmother, the tale is filled with archetypes, psychological undertones, and cultural messages that have been embedded into the story over centuries. The key elements of Snow White, the poisoned apple, the magic mirror, and the 7 dwarfs, are not just fantastical devices. They carry deeper meanings that speak to the human condition, societal fears, and the battle between good and evil. One of the most striking symbols in Snow White is the poisoned apple. On the surface, the apple might seem like a simple plot device, something that causes Snow White's fall into an eternal sleep. However, the apple is much more than that. It is a symbol of temptation, corruption, and the dangerous consequences of desire. In many cultures, apples are seen as symbols of knowledge, temptation, and the fall from innocence. This connection to the biblical story of Adam and Eve, where Eve bites into the forbidden fruit and brings about the downfall of humanity, is not incidental. Just as Eve's decision to eat the apple brings her and Adam into a state of fallibility and suffering, Snow White's encounter with the poisoned apple represents her own fall from grace, albeit a fall that is manipulated by the malevolent actions of her stepmother. The apple, as a symbol of temptation, plays into one of the central themes of the story, the tension between innocence and the corrupting influence of external forces. Snow White, in her innocence, is vulnerable to the apple's lure, much like how children or naive individuals are often susceptible to the dangers of the world around them. The apple's poison can be seen as a metaphor for the destructive forces of envy and malice, forces that, once introduced into a pure heart, can lead to ruin. Another crucial symbol in the story is the magic mirror, which serves as a tool for the stepmother's obsessive need to maintain her power and beauty. The mirror represents self-reflection and vanity. In the stepmother's case, it is her obsessive need for external validation that drives her to insanity. The mirror's declaration that Snow White is the fairest of them all is the catalyst for the stepmother's jealousy and her subsequent attempts to destroy Snow White. But the mirror is also a symbol of self-awareness, or the lack thereof. The stepmother's inability to see herself as anything other than the fairest blinds her to the inherent danger she poses to herself and others. Mirrors, in many psychological and literary contexts, symbolize self-identity and self-perception. The stepmother's dependence on the mirror for validation reveals a psychological flaw: her inability to see beyond her own superficial desires, and her lack of empathy for others. This reliance on the mirror as a means of judging herself also mirrors societal expectations placed on women to meet certain standards of beauty and worth. The stepmother's actions highlight the destructive nature of vanity, showing how unchecked obsession with one's appearance can lead to internal and external harm. The dwarfs, though often seen as simple helpers in the story, carry their own symbolic weight. In many ways, the dwarfs represent the opposite of the stepmother. While she embodies vanity, greed, and malice, the dwarfs are portrayed as kind-hearted, protective, and humble. They live in isolation, removed from the world of power and jealousy that the stepmother represents. Their protection of Snow White reflects a return to innocence and goodness, a retreat from the harmful forces that exist outside their small, secluded world. The dwarfs, too, can be seen as representing various facets of the human psyche. Each dwarf, in some interpretations, reflects a different aspect of the inner self, such as joy, anger, greed, or sorrow. Their personalities serve as a reminder of the complexity of human nature and the balance of virtues and flaws that exist within each of us. In a way, the dwarves serve as Snow White's protectors, not just physically, but psychologically, guiding her towards safety and redemption. The dynamic between Snow White and the dwarves offers an image of mutual care and support, one that contrasts sharply with the hostility and isolation represented by the stepmother. Beyond these specific symbols, Snow White is a story that engages with broader societal themes, especially concerning gender roles and the notion of beauty. Snow White's passive nature, her ability to endure hardship without resistance, can be interpreted as a reflection of traditional gender expectations placed on women during the time the story was first told. Snow White's passivity may seem to offer a critique of women's roles in society, portraying them as victims of their circumstances. However, it can also be seen as a symbol of virtue, an innocent, untainted soul that remains pure despite the evil around her. Her eventual rescue and triumph over the evil stepmother suggest that goodness, when left untarnished, will ultimately prevail. On the other hand, the stepmother's character can be seen as representing the darker, more complex side of female power. Unlike Snow White, the stepmother is active and aggressive, but her power is derived from a destructive source: jealousy and insecurity. She is a cautionary figure, warning of the dangers of unchecked female ambition and vanity. Her obsessive need to be the most beautiful reflects the societal pressure on women to maintain physical perfection and to seek validation from others. This rivalry between Snow White and her stepmother thus reflects deeper anxieties about women's roles in society and the destructive potential of envy. Ultimately, the symbolism in Snow White conveys not only the battle between good and evil, but also the internal struggles we face in reconciling innocence with the darker aspects of human nature. The story, through its rich symbolism, explores the fragility of beauty, the dangers of envy, and the power of kindness and selflessness. It also reflects the tensions that exist in the world, tensions between purity and corruption, passivity and aggression, innocence and experience. In Snow White, beauty and vanity are intertwined with concepts of power and destruction. The poisoned apple, the magic mirror, and the dwarves all serve to underscore the deep psychological and cultural themes embedded within the story, offering timeless lessons that resonate across generations.